Hello and welcome to this next video, which is a follow-up from the video where I made this box and I made these physical media of old-time radio shows that I have. So I figured in this video we can go over what's in the box. So I don't want to make this too long of a video, so I'm just going to start off with pulling them randomly. So I'm going to start with this one. This is just a compendium collection of various stories, various shows, I should say, from the BBC and the CBC. I'll just leave it here. You could pause and read which shows. So that is just something I made called Night Tales. What else do we have here? You know what? Actually, we should start with, here it is. This is, there's two of them on here. It's a very small SD. And if you haven't watched the previous video, there is a micro SD and an adapter for SD format. And anyway, so this is the War of the Worlds Panic broadcast and the Call of Cthulhu. I'm a big fan of this type of horror. In fact, I'm really into board games, and there's a board game called Elder Sign I'm a big fan of, which is takes place in the H.P. Lovecraft's universe of monsters. So there's Call of Cthulhu. And then there's the, like I said, the War of the Worlds Panic broadcast, which is, this is the original broadcast by Orson Welles. And from what I read, it's kind of an exaggeration of what happened. The U.S. did not panic because the ratings for the show was pretty low to begin with. And it was more the press conference on Halloween, the day after, in 1938, I believe. Which got more attention than the actual broadcast itself. So, I got these two on there. It was just a small SD, so I figured I'd just use it for that. All right, next, this is not old time radio. It is radio. This is Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM show. I'm a big fan of radio, more AM than FM, because I figure if I want to listen to music, I'll just listen to Spotify. This is 195 random episodes from 1992 to 2013 that I pulled off the internet. And I think Art Bell's one of the greatest talk show radio hosts of all time. He passed away, I believe, in 2018. And if you don't know anything about this show, it was a show that started in the 90s. And they mainly talked about like UFOs and ghosts and Bigfoot and all kinds of weird stuff. Also some science topics. It wasn't just paranormal stuff. But time travel is one of them. But if you search YouTube, if you know nothing about Art Bell, I would recommend looking up Mel's Hole, just trying to find all the episodes in sequence talking about Mel's Hole. It's pretty fascinating. And that will give you a taste of what Art Bell was about. One factoid about Art Bell that I didn't know was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was his call that he made to, I don't know where. He was a radio operator, and he had to make a call during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And his call is what set the NORAD, I think it's NORAD, to set the DEFCON level up one. So, he raised the DEFCON level because of, I guess, what he spotted or whatever it was. So anyway, that's a little Art Bell factoid. Big fan. All right, so continuing along. Okay, here's Mystery House. This is from the Golden Age of Radio, 1945, 1946. I don't know too much about this. It has to do with a publishing house who started this from New York. And it had to do with, what I read was they were testing stories to see if they were worth printing and made, making them into books. So anyway, that's Mystery House. Ghost stories. So these are just various ghost stories, basically audiobooks. There's 49 stories on here. I always like a good ghost story, listening to it by the lake type of thing. Here's one I don't know too much about, The Weird Circle. This aired from 1943 and 1945, or 78 episodes. One thing about old-time radio, what you'll discover is that there are a lot of missing episodes just because, things happen. There are fires, things just break down, things get lost. So when it comes to old time radio, there are a lot of lost episodes. And the biggest example of that would have to be The Man in Black. So here is Appointment with Fear. So this is The Man in Black, and he's going to introduce each story. Now check this out. These episodes are from 1943 to 1945. I think there was over 1,000 produced. Could be maybe, just shy of 1,000. But there are only 4 surviving episodes. But in 1976 and 1977, they revised 7 episodes. Remade, I should say. It's not like they found them. They just redid them. And this actually continued into this, which is Fear on BBC 4. And The Man in Black, Appointment with Fear, was a BBC program, by the way. Here's 48 episodes, and this aired from 1988 to 1997. So they sort of resurrected The Man in Black in the 90s, was it the 80s? Yeah, the 80s into the 90s. And even today, you could find The Man in Black episodes, but you have to pay for those. Anyway, that's that. Now, one thing you'll notice is with these old time radio shows is the idea of a host or a character, not a host, but a character introducing stories. Like, for example, this one, The Hermit's Cave. So you're going to go into this cave and there's this hermit and he's going to tell you these spooky stories. So the idea of a character introducing spooky stories and anthologies came from old time radio. That's where the idea of using a character. So for example, if we look at this is the Sealed Book. Now the Sealed Book pretty much ripped off The Hermit's Cave and another one called Witch's Tale, where only 10% of the episodes survived. And Witch's Tale was probably the first one to have a character introduce stories. And the Sealed Book just ripped off what it said. I don't know. I just found some articles online that they ripped off pretty much The Hermit's Cave and the Witch's Tale. And the keeper of the book, in this case, is going to introduce you to these stories. Now, here's the interesting part. The keeper of the book is the inspiration to the Crypt Keeper, which comes from Tales of the Crypt, which started as a comic book by EC Comics, Horror Comics, in the 1950s. And William Gaines, the guy who inherited the comic book company from his father, most likely loved these things, these radio shows, just like a lot of people of that generation did. Larry King was one of them, the famous talk show host. And yeah, the Sealed Book, definitely, I could totally see it, how a young William Gaines was listening to this stuff. And he started his, when he inherited his dad's comic book company, said, hey, why don't we do those things we listened to when we were kids instead, and put it in comic book form. So there's the keeper of the book, and of course the Crypt Keeper. Now the original books, I believe, had 3 hosts. There was the Crypt Keeper, a witch, and I think it was a mortician or a grave keeper. I don't know. I can't remember. Fascinating book. I love those books. I own the digital copies. But anyway, pretty cool stuff. So going forward, what's next? Okay, here's Quiet Please, 1947 to 1949. This was who was involved with this? This was a guy named Arch Obler, who was pretty big on these shows. He was a pretty big name, and we'll get to him in a bit. In fact, here we go. We have Arch Obler's Place from 1939, the Christmas holiday season from 1939 to 1940, and NBC also in 1945 aired, I don't know how many episodes, I haven't listened to it, but this is Arch Obler. He did a lot of these. He worked on a lot of these anthology horror shows, and these are his plays. And speaking of Arch Obler, and probably one of the biggest, earliest ones, is Lights Out. Now, the only horror anthology radio show to predate this is Witch's Tale, which we talked about earlier. And this ran from 1934 to 1947. Here are 85 episodes. I don't know if these are surviving episodes or if these are all the possible episodes. I doubt it. But Lights Out was massive. Huge hit. If you look up on YouTube, Modern Marvels Radio, it'll come. It's a little documentary. I think it was from the 90s on Discovery Channel, maybe, where they talk about the history of radio. And Larry King's on there, and he's talking about Lights Out and how he loved it. This also turned into a TV show once TV took over radio. When people transitioned from radio to television for this type of entertainment, there was an episode. You could watch a few of them on YouTube. They're really like horribly lit, and they're not really well produced. Like if you're expecting a Twilight Zone, no, it wasn't like that. And it was live, by the way. It looked like, at least from the ones I saw, it looked like it was a live production, like a play, and they were just broadcasting it. So there's a lot of mistakes in it, a lot of fumbling from actors. But is it worth a watch? No. The radio is worth a listen to. The radio program is worth a listen to. But anyway, that's Lights Out, one of the biggest shows. And let's continue with the big shows. Here is The Shadow. Now, tell me if this sounds familiar. The Shadow is about a billionaire in his time. He was a millionaire in his day. It's about his character that was published first in a detective magazine and then got his own show in 1937 called The Shadow. This is a massive show, hugely popular show back in the day. This is like the Seinfeld, Friends. I don't know how what other show I can use to give a sense of how big this show is. Now, like I said, it started as a story in a detective comic, and it is about a millionaire, a billionaire in today's standards, who traveled the world and studied mysticisms and magic of ancient religions. And he mastered, I guess you could say, or he broke down the science of how to cloud men's minds to make them think you're invisible or they can't see you. Stuff like that. Anyway, he returns to the States, breaks down the science, and uses that to fight crime. He has no superpowers. He's just using science, apparently, to fight crime. Does that sound familiar? Well, 2 years later, Batman came out in 1939. And the creator of Batman has referenced The Shadow. But after listening to a few episodes, I got to say that this is literally version 1 of Bruce Wayne. So this is what inspired Batman. There was a movie, I think it was in the 80s or could have been the 90s, starring Alec Baldwin, where they tried to make it a movie. It wasn't a great movie. The pinball machine, though, that was inspired by the movie was fantastic. It's actually one of the best pinball machines you could find or play. So I love pinball too. So anyway, that is The Shadow. A lot of history with The Shadow. And also, I think I read somewhere they're actually trying to bring it back. There's a script floating around out there that people are interested in turning this into a movie again. I don't know if it'll be streaming or in the theater, but that's that. All right, let's continue really quick. Here is BBC Haunted. These are just ghost stories or plays. This aired from 1980 and 1984, 26 episodes. What else do we got here that's of note? Here's a collection of Ray Bradbury science fiction stories. Love science fiction. And these range from 1959 to 2014. Once again, the BBC. Okay, so here is a massive, massive show. This is probably the definition of a golden age of radio. Now, it depends who you talk to, about the golden age of radio. Radio was around for a while at the turn of the century, but the end of the 20s, it was so popular that manufacturers couldn't keep up. There was a shortage of radios. Then by the 30s, most people had radios. So this aired from 1940 to 1962. So the golden age of radio, again, depends who you talk to, can either be from the 20s to the 60s, early 60s, but I personally think it was probably the 30s mid 30s to the 60s, in my opinion. Some people will say it was right after World War II. That's when television started to take off. But I think 62 is when television became ubiquitous. Late 50s, early 60s. And that's what pretty much killed off radio dramas, period. Full stop. Now, radio, of course, found its salvation in the 50s with the transistor. Transistor radio turned these giant radios that were the size of fish tanks in living rooms or massive television sets from the 80s, and turned, now you can bring it to the beach. It's in your car because of the transistor, which was a huge invention at the time. And what saved radio was music, right? Because nobody, by this time, 1960s, early 60s, nobody was tuning into the radio for dramas. So anyway, continuing along, here is Dimension X. This is the 1950s, 1950, 1951. Science fiction. This is pure science fiction. This is the era of drive-ins and transistor radios and those type of movies with giant bugs. The giant 50-foot tall woman, for example, comes to mind. So this is Dimension X, and it is that great science fiction stuff. And there was a follow-up a few years later called X-1. This lasted a bit longer. This was 1955 to 1958, so it lasted about 3 years. The first few episodes on this are basically just retellings of Dimension X, but then they get into their own stuff. And anyway, sci-fi. Do I have any more sci-fi? I think I have one. Here it is, another sci-fi. This is a bit more modern. I believe this is 1984. Vanishing Point. This is the CBC, Canadian radio. And I ran out of large cases, so I had to use the small case. Just science fiction stories, I think. I haven't listened to it yet, but they're pretty much science fiction stories. And I love science fiction. Here's another old one, classic golden age of radio, The Whistler, and yet another character introducing you to these stories. And this ran from 42 to 55. Very popular show. And The Whistler. Yeah, I think at the beginning of the episode, you hear footsteps and a guy whistling. And then, of course, he talks about the episode that is coming up. So, Sleep No More. This is kind of interesting. When was this released? This was released in the 50s. So, once again, the age of the drive-in. Sleep No More. So this is performed by a guy named Nelson Olmsted, and he does the whole thing. There's sound effects, there's music and all that, but he's doing all the voices. It's not just narrating, from what I understand. It's not like an audiobook. He's actually acting out all the characters in the story. Not a lot of episodes. There's only 19 episodes, but so there you go. Sleep No More. That I haven't listened to it yet. Here's another anthology, but this anthology involves adventure. It's not really horror. It could be suspense, I guess you could say. But from what I understand, it's more about adventure. It's Indiana Jones type stuff. And a massively popular show, 1947, 1954, 250 episodes. So there's Escape. Don't know too much more about that, but it's there. Here's The Inner Sanctum, a very... a heavily referenced whenever you talk about old time radio. This is one show that keeps coming up, and these 91 episodes from 1947 to 1949. I don't know if that is the entire run of Inner Sanctum, but regardless, here's some more modern stuff. 1980 to 1983. This is Nightfall from the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting. I think there's some BBC on there too. They aired some BBC, but also created their own. So Nightfall from the 80s. And here's Hall of Fantasy. This is from the golden age of radio again. The era of drive-ins, Hall of Fantasy. Don't know too much about this. Here's a few I'm going to bring up right now. I should group them because this is, for example, Dark Fantasy. This is in 1940s. 1941 to 1942. But then there's The Price of Fear. Now, this aired from 1973 to 1983, and it starred Vincent Price. Those of you who don't know, Vincent Price is the guy in the Michael Jackson video who does the monologue and the laugh at the end. That's Vincent Price, very famous actor in horror. So you got Vincent Price. So this came out in 1973. You also have the 0 Hour, the great Rod Serling. And this is, I believe, shortly after. This aired, 1973 again to 1974. 130 episodes. So this is shortly after Night Gallery, which was a television show hosted by Rod Serling, which was trying to ride the success of the Twilight Zone. And if you don't know, which you should, Rod Serling is the guy at the beginning of every Twilight Zone. He's the guy who introduces all the stories. So they're trying to ride that success, but apparently Rod Serling hated the show. There's a great segment on the Dick Cavett show, which you can find on YouTube, where he talks about how it's nothing like the Twilight Zone, and he describes it as a run through the cemetery, meaning there's no substance. It's not as deep as the Twilight Zone. I have not watched it. I'm in the process of trying to get my hands on Night Gallery, but it does sound, from what I read online, it's more shallow than the Twilight Zone. Twilight Zone is just it's my top 3 shows of all time. I have the box set. I love it. I love anthologies. So anyway, there's Rod Serling, 1973, and here's a big one. This is the CBS Mystery Theater. This aired from 1974 and 1982. So one thing you're noticing with these 3 shows is they're all coming out at the same time. And what I think is happening is kind of a mirror of what is happening today. So, for example, the people who grew up with, say, Quiet Please or The Sealed Book, they're all adults now. They're middle-aged. And now they have a nostalgia for those days of yore, for those days when they sat around and listened to spooky stories on the radio. And I think that's what these are. These are kind of like, there's a market for it. Let's bring back that nostalgia. Let's capitalize on it. Especially this one. This one's riddled with commercials. I think this is at the tail end of Rod Serling's career. I think he died in 1970. I think he died a year after this, didn't he? Or 2 years later? But anyway, this is towards the end, and you could tell it's just a cash grab. So what do I mean by what's happening today? Well, Gen Xers are getting, all the movies that Gen Xers grew up with and all the IPs. There was this huge resurgence of bringing it all back. So I think, there's like this cycle of that's going to go forward with entertainment. So back in the day, it was radio shows. Those people grew up. They tried to bring it back, and it was successful. This ran for 10 years. 1974 and 1982. It ran for 8 years, but it was successful. There's like 1,399 episodes on here. So there is kind of like, hey, let's go back to, or let's revisit our childhood nostalgia type of thing when it comes to media. And I think going forward, once we get through this rebooting of everything in Hollywood stage, there will eventually be some sort of tie-in with video games for the Gen Zs. They're going to remember, or the older millennials, maybe younger millennials, with things like Minecraft. There could be a big Minecraft movie coming out, or whatever it is in the future. Now, again, it might not be movies. The way things are going, it looks like movies are dying. But I don't know. I have no idea. It might be, rebooting of video games or something. I have no idea. So anyway, those are the 1970s. What else we have here? 1958, The Unexpected, 23 episodes. These are 15-minute shows with a twist ending. That's the whole point. That was the whole gimmick of this show. Once again, I'm using a small case for this because I ran out of the big ones. Here is Chillers. This is pretty good. I really enjoyed these stories. I've listened to this whole thing. This was on BBC between January 24th, 2002 to February 14th, 2002. So there's that. Oh, here we go. BBC. BBC loves radio. England is still jamming on the radio. This aired from 2002 to 2012. It's basically retelling the Twilight Zone television shows. Very cool. Very cool. So there's that. Here is The Mysterious Traveler. Once again, a massively popular show. 1943, 1952, 9 years. Once again, you're going to board this this train, and the mysterious traveler is going to tell you a spooky story. And finally, we have the tail end, and I saved this for last. This is considered one of the final shows, and this is only 8 episodes. It's called Macabre, and it aired from 1961 to 1962. This is this is when people were just saying, I'm watching TV, I'm not going to bother with listening to dramas on radio. So this is one of the final shows. I'm sure there was more after this. And then it turned into that nostalgia thing we talked about. So anyway, oops, I think my mic cut out there. So anyway, that doesn't really matter. I'm at the end of this video. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.